when Jim Jordan says on camera repeatedly, "I did not know anything," obviously we have a lot of people saying he knew, I told him. But to me, the most damning thing in a way is that Charlotte Remniak, who was the fencing coach, she knew and she complained. And she was a woman and she was not in the locker room. And a lot of this happened and was talked about in the locker room. And Jim Jordan was in the locker rooms.
Our guest is Eva Orner, who directed Surviving Ohio State, an extraordinary documentary on a 2-decade-long sex scandal where the team doctor, Richard Strauss, sexually abused hundreds of athletes, even raping dozens. Especially victimized was the wrestling team. Strauss would shower with the athletes, sometimes masturbating while he was doing it. If they came in for an ear or a shoulder problem, he would massage their genitals. There have been other sex abuse scandals at Penn State and Michigan State, among others, but university presidents and top coaches were fired. There was accountability. By contrast, Ohio State covered up these crimes, and no one has really paid any price except those young athletes. Eva, you know, it is amazing. How did Ohio State get away with this?
It's a really good question. God, you start with hard questions. I mean, I think they got away with it for so long because it happened during the 70s to the 90s, and it was a time when people didn't talk about this. I think the survivors, I prefer to call them survivors than victims, but the survivors were predominantly, Midwestern, innocent, pretty young, sexually inexperienced. There was no internet. You couldn't Google what is a hernia check. You couldn't check anything. There was no one to talk to. It wasn't like you went and there was an HR department and you were told to look out for grooming or molestation. So I think there was an element of they were kids at the time, not knowing what was happening to them. There was also, I think, shame, embarrassment, homophobia. If you said something had happened to you, you'd be called like you'd be labeled as being gay or something, which at the time was really terrible. I think there's a whole combination of reasons, but when people did complain, Ohio State did nothing, and that's very documented in the film. People knew and they didn't do anything.
No, it sure is. And these former wrestlers like Nick DiSabato, I think I'm pronouncing his name correctly, whose family is wrestling royalty, at
Yes.
Ohio State, they opened up to you about these painful, humiliating experiences. That took real courage.
I always come back to this when I talk about the film. I spoke to probably 100 survivors, roughly 100 survivors, most of them, and I completely understand and respect. They do not want to go public. They do not want to be on camera. It's a really tough thing to do. And so the survivors that are in the film are incredibly brave. Their families support them and are brave. They live in, small communities that are sports crazy, that are, the Buckeyes are like almost like a cult. It's very hard to go against them in Columbus, especially. So the guys are super brave. And I think what's really interesting is, they came out 7 years ago in 2018, inspired by the Larry Nassar story and
Right.
the survivors speaking out. But they got the absolute opposite reaction. They were vilified. They were not believed. People had that sort of very typical male response of, if it was me, I would have beat the shit out of Strauss. And so they weren't heard. And what's really changed is, and also OSU have fought them tooth and nail for 7 years in the courts. And what's really changed since the film came out is they have been heard, and there's such a difference in them. I've been, talking with them and being part of their lives for 3.5 years making this. And they are very different now. They needed to be heard and respected. And all of us, we're on a group chat together. There's 10 of them. And all of us they're all posting, they're getting texts and messages and social media messages from strangers or ex-colleagues or students saying, you are brave, you're amazing, what you've done is incredible. And we're all sharing them. And I think it's really, really helping them all, because that's what they needed. And it's been a real surprise to me how positively it's been received and how it's changed them.
Eva, I have written columns on this, and James and I have focused on it in this podcast, particularly on the assistant wrestling coach during these sexual crimes, and now a powerful member of Congress, Jim Jordan. He claims he never knew anything about this. There was this massive sexual abuse going on in the showers, the locker rooms. Jim Jordan, I didn't know anything, but you had a number of those wrestlers and a former referee who said Jim Jordan knew everything about this, right?
Yeah, look, I think when the guys came out in 2017, they thought people would believe them because that's what we do. We believe survivors of sexual abuse and sexual assault, but they weren't. And then they thought, okay, if anyone's going to help us, it's going to be the two people that we looked up to as Jim as a brother, Russ Hellickson as a father figure, who were the coach and the assistant coach for a period of time at OSU. And both of them have not only let the guys down. I mean, Russ went quiet and Jim Jordan has said he didn't know anything. And I think I really wanted to show in the film the extent to which Ohio State knew at the time, how many reports were made, how many people knew, how many horrible decisions were made by people at OSU. And I think when Jim Jordan says on camera repeatedly, I did not know anything, obviously we have a lot of people saying he knew, I told him. But to me, the most damning thing in a way is that Charlotte Remniak, who was the fencing coach, she knew and she complained. And she was a woman and she was not in the locker room. And a lot of this happened and was talked about in the locker room. And Jim Jordan was in the locker rooms, and he's, if he had a locker in the wrestling room and Dr. Strauss was having showers all the time with the athletes and he didn't see it, that's very hard to believe or understand.
Well, it's impossible to believe. And
Yeah.
DeSabato said again, he's just showing nothing but courage, no reason not to tell the truth. He said Jordan tried to get him to change his story and even cried and begged. And one of the referees who says Strauss made a play for him in the shower went and told Jordan about it, who just shrugged it off and said, well, that's just Strauss.
Yeah.
I mean, there is no doubt he knew, I think, and he has paid no price. He lies. He was the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, and he's lying about covering up a crime, which I believe is a crime itself.
I would agree with you, and I would say, unfortunately, now there is no surprise in politicians lying. It's become the norm, and it's shocking and abhorrent. And I think the film is pretty rock solid in showing that he lied. And obviously, Adam DeSabato, testified before Congress about this, about Jim Jordan calling him and crying and saying, you need to change your story, you've got to support me. And I think that's a big moment. But also Fred Feeney, who was a wrestling referee, his story is really important because he wasn't 18 or 20 at the time and powerless and dependent on Dr. Strauss to pass him physically so he could compete. Fred Feeney was 40 years old at the time, and he was abused by Dr. Strauss, and he felt powerless like a lot of victims of sexual abuse, and he didn't do anything, and he was ashamed and he was shocked. But he did walk out and he did say to Russ and to Russ Hellickson and Jim Jordan what happened to him, and he says very firmly that Jim Jordan said, oh, that's just Strauss. Right. So there's time after time after time where we show that Jim Jordan knew, and for him to, he has said nothing since the film came out. His communications person released another statement saying he didn't know anything. I reached out to get an interview and they did not do an interview. And I think that they are just saying nothing in the hope that this will blow away and, disappear. But if you look at social media, which I always think is an interesting gauge, the conversation about this film, I'd say 80 or 90% of the comments are about Jim Jordan.
Yeah. James.
So obviously the victims of this unspeakable act were males. Would it have been a different result had there been females? I mean, is it a little bit like, oh, suck it up, shit, man, you're 18 years old, what are you talking about? Do you have a sense of that?
I think that's one of the really big problems, and we talk about that a lot in the film. If it's and we actually use footage of the survivors of Larry Nassar, because when you see them standing up in court and testifying, it's very easy to understand what happened to them. When you look at someone like Mark Coleman, who's a big WWF fighter, all these guys are big and now they're in their 40s and 50s. I think it's a real stretch to understand why it happened. And we talk about it a lot in the film, the inability for them to communicate what was happening to them, the shame, the embarrassment, and also that they were dependent on their scholarships. I mean, if they spoke out or if they didn't have a medical exam, they weren't cleared to play. And what's really telling is that this scandal kind of broke when it was a non-athlete student who made the complaint. That's when it really started, because he had nothing to lose. Steve Snyder-Hill, he wasn't an athlete. So the athletes had everything to lose. And the really heartbreaking part is a lot of them dropped out of college. I've spoken to so many who dropped out of college and they never talked about why. They never told their parents why. Al Nowakowski, who's in the film, would have gone on to be a pro hockey player. He never graduated. He dropped out. He never played hockey again. He would have been a very successful athlete. Dan Ritchie dropped out of college and he never told his father why, because, again, 20, 30 years ago, you couldn't talk about this kind of subject. So the fact that they are men has been a huge difference in this story, and it's made the general public until now, I think, not believe them to a degree. But I think the film we were very, very careful to make sure that there were so many people saying the same thing independently that it's pretty rock solid. I don't see any audience members watching this film and saying, I don't believe these men. It's absolutely heartbreaking what happened to them.
There's a behemoth at the Center Ball, isn't it? It's known as the Ohio State University, which is a very large, and I can assure you, very powerful institution. Did the Ohio State University do anything to try to find out about this? Say, was there an investigative report they got or anything along those lines?
Yeah. So, we talk about in the film that complaints were made between the mid-70s and the mid-90s when this happened, but nothing was done. There was no follow-up. And then nothing really happened. He wasn't even fired. He left the school. He left the school with emeritus status, even though they knew he had done things. And years went by, and it wasn't until 2018 when Mike DeSabato first came out with this story. And OSU initially did what universities should do in this situation, and they did a very expensive independent investigation through the law firm, strangely, Perkins Coie, who have been under attack from Donald Trump. And no one expected the report, the independent investigation into the Strauss abuse. The report was much worse than anyone thought, and we use it a lot in the film. And initially it was a few hundred victims were identified, and there was, I think, 37 instances of rape. It was terrible. But what came out after the guys went public and after some time had elapsed is we now know there are over 2,000 victims and 271 rapes that we know about. And I've spoken to many survivors who are not part of the lawsuit, who have never come out publicly and who never will because of the shame, and their families don't want them to. So there are more. It is so huge, the scale of this. And over 200 men have still not settled. And OSU are really tricky, and I have to be careful when I talk about this, but they constantly release a statement saying, we are not the same school, we have changed, we initiated the independent investigation. But they initiated it after the guys came out, right? So that's one thing.
Sorry, I didn't mean to laugh in the middle of the explanation, but I had to laugh.
So that's one thing they do. And then they say, we have offered, really generous settlements to the guys. And some of them have accepted them. But what they don't say, and what we talk about in the film, is there are problems with the settlements. So the settlements are paltry in comparison to Penn State and Michigan State, which averaged $1 to $1.5 million per survivor. They're offering on average $250,000. And what what you can deduce from that is that they're saying, male survivors are worth less than female survivors, possibly. And that's one of the problems. The other problem is they refuse to admit liability in the settlements that the survivors would have to sign. And this is the worst part. Some of the settlements were demanding the survivors could never publicly criticize OSU. So, of course, a lot of people have not signed the settlements, and they never talk about that. And that's something I really want to get out there, because I think the implication that they make is that these guys are being difficult. They don't want to sign these generous settlements, but these settlements are not generous. People's lives were destroyed.
Yeah, I just make so people understand, the Ohio State University's athletic department is second only to the University of Texas in total revenue. It is a behemoth. It is powerful. It is wealthy. And it frankly didn't do anything,
Yeah. So, we talk about their figures since 2018, when the guys first came out with these claims. The athletic department at OSU has made over $1.2 billion in revenue. There are about 250 men who have not yet settled. You can do the math. If they were all offered $1 or $1.5 million, it wouldn't make any difference to Ohio State. So the big question is why won't they settle this generously and in the way that men deserve, and in comparison with other situations like this? And if they did, we would not be talking about it. This film would not have been made. Don Wertheim would not have written the article for Sports Illustrated, which started this whole process. And yet they've still given no indication that they want to do that. So since the day after the film came out, they were back in court. So there was Colleen Marshall told me this, who is the journalist who's in the film, who's covered it locally a lot. Because the other thing about this story is it hasn't gotten big national attention, which is, again, I think because it's men and it's difficult for people to understand. And Colleen told me that the district court judge is ordering them into mediation. And she's an attorney, so she knows about this situation. And she said, but I was in court yesterday, this is the day after the film came out, and neither side seemed to expect resolution anytime soon. So the other thing that's really heartbreaking is this has been going on for 7 years for these men. They've had 7 years of being ridiculed, embarrassed, not listened to. That's, I think, changed because of the film, which is great. But the court case isn't scheduled yet. It'll be 2026 or 2027. So this is going to drag on potentially for another few years. And it's really painful for them. And again, I just say, why can't this university do the right thing, honor these men, and offer them...
Sorry. I follow college sports too much.
Yeah. But they won't do it while other schools have done it.
Well, congratulations on a really important film, and it is the oldest dynamic in the world. It's power and evil versus victims and, scared young men. I mean, anytime you can illuminate that.
Yeah,
Albert, go ahead.
Eva, you talk about the other at Penn State and Michigan State, which was awful. I'm not sure it was as bad as Ohio State. The university presidents were fired. The athletic directors were fired. Joe Paterno, the legendary coach, was fired. No one, to my knowledge, at Ohio State has been fired. Is that a fair assessment?
The tricky thing is that this didn't come out till years later. This stopped happening in the mid-90s. Strauss left the college in the mid-90s, and at the time they didn't, it wasn't acknowledged when he was still there. And now it's like 25 years later. So that's the other thing that's happened is I think time has made a difference here. But there hasn't been a lot of repercussions for a lot of people. There's one doctor who was disbarred because of this from the medical board.
Right, but on a separate line or something. But, you mentioned the Perkins-Coie, and it did lay out a number of the offenses. But I thought I was disappointed when I read about it because it didn't name names. I think in that sense it went in the tank to Ohio State. Jim Jordan claimed that report vindicated him. Why did that law firm have to cop out like that?
I don't know exactly, but, in that report, it does say that many coaches knew.
Right.
And Jim Jordan routinely says, we have him in the film saying it's an old clip where he says, no, coaches didn't know. So there's also just a lot of, people lie now. Fake news is a thing. The problem with the Perkins Coie report, I think, is that they couldn't approach anybody. You had to go to them as a survivor and tell your story. And so I think many hundreds, if not thousands of survivors either didn't know or weren't equipped to do that, because it's pretty scary going and talking to a bunch of lawyers and telling them that, 30, 20 years ago when you were young, your doctor was like groping you and doing inappropriate things or raping you. So there's an awful lot of people I've spoken to who are not representative in that report. I think what that report did was it announced that this happened, that it was you couldn't argue that this had happened. It is fact. So I think it was strong enough in terms of that. It said that there were numerous rapes. It said that people knew, coaches, trainers, administration knew, but it was anonymous, and I think that's very problematic.
Well, I think you made this point, but there are people who say, well, wait a minute, these were big guys, these were big wrestlers,
Yeah.
and some, puny doctor goes and sexually, why didn't they just, beat the hell out of him? And people, I think, don't fully realize what your film documents. This guy held tremendous power over these athletes. If he didn't pass them, they lose their scholarship. I mean,
They'd lose their scholarship and their careers. He had all the power, and they were young, they were naive, they weren't informed. Dan Ritchie says, I didn't know what grooming was. It's a very different time now. And that's one of the things I've always said to the guys. No matter what this film does, if one kid watches this film and either gets out of a situation or speaks up or tells somebody, it was worth speaking out. And I think it's done a lot more than that, because a lot of people have been watching this film. In the first, second or third day it was out, it was number one on Max. And I think a lot of people are watching it. A lot of people are talking about it. And the guys are finally getting the respect and the belief that they deserved, that they were sort of robbed of for the last 7 years. And that's where I come back to the guys, and I just think they're so strong. Their families are so strong. I mean, one of the sons of one of the guys in the film, I want to keep it anonymous, I think he was about 15 or 16 when we filmed. And we're in people's houses. I meet the wives. People have to trust you. And I got back to LA and I got a message from a 15 or 16-year-old son of one of the survivors, and it said, thank you for doing this for my family. It means so much to me. And I've done a lot of really tough films. I'm already feeling it now. And I burst into tears, which has never happened to me before. I mean, I've worked with refugees and, I've made films in Afghanistan and in Iran and Lebanon, and I've seen terrible things, and I've done other abuse films. But there's something about this and the men not being believed and heard that is different. And it's think about it. There's been some of the kids of the survivors it's been half their lives that they've been dealing with their dads going through this. It's really cruel. It's a very cruel story to the survivors, I think.
Let me ask one more and turn it back to James. Yeah, there are these suits you say won't probably come to court to 26 or 27, but they will come to court. Will Jim Jordan have to testify under oath?
He'll be deposed. You saw in the film we have depositions of Dr. Grace and Dr. Lombardo. That had already been done, so we were lucky to be able to get them. But top of the list is deposing Russ Hellickson, Jim Jordan. But the concern is now. I mean, I this is a question, not a statement. But do people now lie under oath? What do you guys think?
I forget. I didn't know. I mean, whatever new lie he has to come up with, James.
Yeah, I think I was going to get elected. Gee, that was a long time ago. I heard something about it, but I didn't follow up. I mean, it's bullshit. So before I let you go, it's obviously you're obviously a female director. This is almost an exclusively male story. Do you think being a female gave you were you able to bring a different eye to this, or do you think it was a story no matter what? I mean, just talk a little bit about that, because I find that to be fascinating.
I think it's different, honestly, because I'm a woman, and this will make you laugh, but obviously I'm Australian. I've lived in America for 21 years. I'm going to say that I'm a citizen so they don't deport me, because I'm a citizen of America, but which won't stop them. But when the story first came to me through the producers and my agents, I said no. I was like, my gut, you go with your gut. You guys know that. And I was like,
Yeah.
I don't think I should do this. I'd recently done a film called Bikram for Netflix, which was about the hot yoga guru who abused women. And I honestly, 3.5, 4 years ago, I don't think I knew what OSU was. I certainly had never heard of a Buckeye. I'm the opposite of you guys. I do not watch American sport. And so I thought, this is not for me. And I spoke to John Wertheim, who's become a really great friend and I love. And he said, I think you're the right person. Why don't you talk to a few of the guys? So I spoke to 3 of them on Zoom. And all 3 of them said to me in that conversation, wow, I've said things to you that I've never said to anyone else.
That's what I was looking for.
And I thought, oh, shit, there's something in being an outsider, being Australian. I didn't go to college here. I know nothing about college sports. And I mean, there's a line in the film, I think it's Rocky, and he explains what wrestling is in a couple of sentences. And that's because I'd said to him, Rocky, can you explain wrestling to someone, to like a 3-year-old who's not super smart? Like I didn't understand wrestling. And it's been a really interesting journey for us. And I was super nervous showing the film to the guys. I mean, it's been a long process. They've trusted me. They didn't know me. The day before the premiere in Tribeca, HBO were fantastic because I said, I think I need to show it to the guys with their partners. We brought them all to New York, just me and them, and just let them have the emotion and the response without an audience. And then the next day they can watch it with an audience at the premiere. And I sat in the back of the cinema and I was so terrified, a bunch of big tough wrestlers and me in the back. And I didn't watch the film. I watched them watching the film and they were all crying and it was very emotional. And afterwards, I didn't get one, why didn't you do this or why didn't you put this in the film? They got it and they loved it and it changed them and empowered them. And it was I've been doing this for over 25 years and there's something about this story that's really changed and affected me. So it's kind of full circle, but it's kind of weird that I made this very masculine film as a female who doesn't know anything about this world. It was an interesting choice, I think.
You would say it's a masculine film. I would say it's a human film.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And also, and it was really great to have Colleen Marshall, the journalist, and also Charlotte Remniak's daughter in the film, just to give it some female perspective. And what was interesting about that is that, they all come into it knowing and believing and adding that extra layer of believing, because that's been one of the biggest things. And I think, finishing on the fact that Jim Jordan has not said anything, has not come out, the university has been very, very quiet. I think that's hugely problematic. And I hope this film, really changes something, but that's optimistic, I think.
Well, let's hope not, because it is the most compelling documentary that I have watched in years. Anybody out there, you need to watch Surviving Ohio State, HBO and Max. It's a story you'll be outraged, you may cry, you may just be you will be dazzled by what Eva has put together. It is a very, very tragic story, but it's a story that really needs to be told. And let's hope, maybe it's too optimistic, but let's hope that Jim Jordan, Russ Hellickson, and The Ohio State University will face some consequences for this, because, Eva, you have laid the whole story out there.
Thank you, guys. It's been an honor talking to you. I'm such a big fan.
Thank you. Y'all have fun in Rome. Yeah. Wow. I wish I was there. Good.
If you ever want to come, you are both welcome to stay with us. We're such huge fans. Giorgio is geeking out.
Get some artichokes. I love artichokes.
Eva, again, thank you. It's Surviving Ohio State, HBO Max. You have been a fabulous guest.